Good morning, afternoon, and evening, depending where you are. My name is Joe White. I'm the British Consul General based here in San Francisco and the UK's tech envoy to the United States. We appreciate so many of you taking the time this morning to discuss the importance of transportation as one of the ways to tackle climate change, particularly in COP26, which is now entering its second week in the UK here in Glasgow. I'd like to start by thanking our co-hosts in Atlanta for putting this event together with us. It's a pleasure to be co-hosting with you all. Now, the UK, as you may know, is leading the way to double the pace of the global transition to a greener future, making the transition to zero-emission vehicles cheaper and faster for all. For instance, new petrol and diesel cars will no longer be sold in the UK by 2030, putting the UK on course to be the fastest G7 country to decarbonise cars and vans. And the UK is also committed to seeing all cars and vans be fully zero-emission at the tailpipe by 2035. In fact, statistics show that electrical vehicles now account for 1 in 10 new cars sold in the UK, showing that we really are accelerating the pace of change towards this exciting future. But we aren't stopping with the UK alone. COP, as you know, is a global, it's a team international game. The UK presidency launched the COP26 Declaration on Zero-Emission Vehicles with Cars and Vans, a landmark global agreement bringing together national governments, states, regions, cities, vehicle manufacturers, businesses, investors, civil society, almost everyone we could think of, all committed to working towards 100% zero-emission vehicle sales by 2035 in leading markets and no later than 2040 globally. Also at COP, the global agreement on zero-emission trucks and buses was launched by the Netherlands and CalStart. There were 17 US businesses, cities, and states signed up to the COP26 Declaration on Zero-Emission Cars and Vans today. California is one of those important stakeholders. Where I sit in San Francisco, I'm seeing that transition happen today in real time and how much can be done when the government really gets behind it. California's governor, Gavin Newsom, is a strong advocate and leader in this space. And because of his leadership, we're delighted to have him provide some remarks for us today to share just how important this transition is and some of the milestones that California has hit along the way. Over to you, Governor.
Hey, everybody. It's Governor Gavin Newsom here, and it's an honor to sign on to the ZEV Transition Council's declaration, accelerating our effort to shift to 100% zero-emission cars. It goes without saying, climate change is an existential threat. I know you hear that, but those smash-mouth realities are pretty clear to us out here in California. And the cost in terms of tradition, the cost in terms of lives lost, the cost of the taxpayers, cost of inaction, it's just too high. And so it's critical, it goes without saying, it's critical that we accelerate our transition away from fossil fuels and embrace the new technologies and, frankly, some of the older technologies that will help us drastically cut our carbon footprint. I couldn't be more proud that our state has leaned in. We've leaned in as the first state to announce the end of all new car sales by 2035. Not insignificant. When you consider the size, scope, and scale of our state. 40 million Americans living in California, the 5th largest economy in the world. We're going to end the sale of new gas cars by 2035. We're also the first in the world to require, not just the first in the US, but the first in the world to require heavy-duty truck manufacturers transition as well to electric vehicle and zero-emission vehicles by 2045. Because of our targeted rulemaking, not just our audacious goals, but the targeted rulemaking and the investments, I'll talk more about those in a minute, into this space, EVs have become one of California's top exports. In fact, they were the #1 export. A year ago, we're in the top 5 still today. Clean energy policy works. We're also, as I said, putting money where our mouth is. We just invested $4 billion, $3.9 billion to be exact, to accelerate the transition to zero-emission vehicles and to achieve our state's clean transportation goals. An investment that's on the scale of what other nations are spending, not just what other states are spending. So we're trying to step up. We're trying to lean in and lead by example. But we also recognize with humility, we got to go faster. And together we can do just that by reshaping the future of transportation, creating new opportunities for green growth, clean and green growth, as well as the so important job creation, growth and inclusion as it relates to that job creation. But like most parts of the world, we understand that, the reality, the smash mouth realities are here, and the effects of climate change have become part of our daily lives. And so we can't nibble around the edges. We need more bold and audacious solutions and actions. And again, that's why I'm just so pleased to be signing this declaration with all of you and to be part of this global movement.
Thank you so much, Governor. And without further ado, let's get into the full program with our moderator, Reem Youssef, the UK's Climate and Energy Advisor based here in the concert in San Francisco. Take it away, Reem.
Thank you, Joe. Before we begin, I'd just like to remind the audience that this conversation is live streamed on YouTube. I will now turn to our panelists, our distinguished speakers and panelists who are joining us from various parts of the US and the UK. Mike, if I may turn to you first. Mike Abelson, you are the North America CEO of the British vehicle manufacturer Arrival. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Arrival is not only revolutionizing urban mobility, but you're also relying on a very different and highly automated microfactories approach to manufacture your vehicles. Can you tell us more about why you're breaking away from Fordism?
So I really like the governor's words that, solving the climate crisis is going to require bold and audacious action. And I certainly think Arrival is one of the companies taking bold and audacious action. We have reimagined how you would assemble vehicles given all of today's technology. The assembly line, to your point, was invented about 100 years ago before we had all the technology we have available today. And so the goal that Arrival pursues as a company is how can we most quickly reduce carbon emissions? And we think that one of the key levers on that is reducing the cost of electric vehicles so that people aren't paying a premium for zero emission vehicles. We've put in place a number of enablers to do that. One of them is what we call our microfactory approach to manufacturing, where instead of one large central assembly plant, we have smaller plants building smaller volumes located close to the cities that require the zero emission vehicles. We're focusing first on commercial vehicles because we think that's the fastest way to lower emissions, to replace those vehicles that are out on the streets 8 hours a day, every day. And with the microfactory method, many communities will benefit from manufacturing jobs, manufacturing zero emission vehicles in their communities. So it is a very different approach and one that we're very excited about.
Thank you. And I mean, this is the kind of innovation that is needed to ensure that the transition can happen at a global scale. I'd like to dive deeper into that. And if I may turn to Stephen. Stephen Gifford, you're the chief economist at the UK's Faraday Institution that really leads on battery R&D and innovation in the UK. Stephen, we've seen today at COP26 the major announcements on zero emission vehicles and heavy duty vehicles. The UK domestically has its very ambitious targets, as Joe said in his introduction. Beyond policy and regulation, what is the UK doing to develop its zero emission vehicle ecosystem?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Well, the UK is striding, I think, on an ambitious program, both on policy and regulation, but lots more involving government, industry, and university. You've all already heard about the policy announcement about 2030 and 2035. We also have regulation of carbon emissions, which are driving forward sales in the near term. But I think the main areas where we're developing the ecosystem is around gigafactories. So there's a large investment by UK government of 1.3 billion to electrify the automotive industry, and within that there's a £500 million fund towards gigafactories, and we've already been very successful in that. Probably not as successful as the US, I may say, with Tesla, but we're having some success with a new factory in Blythe and one associated with Envision ACS, which was historically linked to Nissan. So there's lots of developments in gigafactories. On the front where I work for the Faraday Institution. So I think we're developing the research and developing an innovation ecosystem. So Faraday Battery Challenge, which is where the Faraday Institution sits, is a government initiative, collaboration with industry and academia. to electrify the UK economy through energy storage in particular. And there's three elements to that. The Faraday Institution focused on low TRL levels, mission-driven research. We have collaborative R&D as well between public and private sector. And we have a UK battery industrialization centre, which is scale up and commercialization. So the research we're looking at is optimizing lithium batteries, for example, but also not forgetting that we also need to look at the next generation of batteries as well. So solid state batteries, which are very important to EVs in maybe 10, 15 years, and other forms, lithium sulfur and other types of chemistry. So we're doing that as well. But I mean, there's lots of other things going on in developing the ecosystem, such as increasing the uptake of zero emission vehicles through a grant to take us to mid-2020s, where we hopefully will get the purchase price to parity for EVs and ICE vehicles. And there's a lot of investment and thinking going on about accelerating charging infrastructure, which is one of the key issues for consumers who don't have EVs. And then finally as well, it's about a sustainable transition and developing the energy resilient system. So connecting EV charging, because the electricity network is going to need changing, and making sure that charging point hubs are connected to a resilient energy system, and there's a rapid charging fund to do that, particularly in the motorway or freeway and major A roads and strategic network. So I think all in all, there's lots going on. We're making great progress. Still lots to do, but as the introductory speaker said, nearly 1 in 10 cars were sold last year were EV. So we're making good progress.
Thank you, Stephen. It's great to hear about what's happening in the UK, and you mentioned Tesla, and this is a good segue to Joe Britton, who is the CEO of the Zero Emission Transportation Association that has members like Tesla, Uber, and others. Joe, we've talked a bit about the UK. Would be keen to get your views on what's happening in the US. We've all seen that President Biden recently signed an executive order calling for 50% of new cars and vans to be zero emission vehicle by 2030. But you guys are calling for a more ambitious target, 100% ZEVs by 2030. Is this more ambitious target feasible technologically and economically? And as Stephen said, will we be reaching price parity with internal combustion engines by that time?
Well, thanks, Reem, for having us. So it is ambitious. We represent 60 companies that all want to get to 100% EV sales by 2030. One of the things I think is really important is that we're not resting on the technology we have today. We've talked about solid state batteries, new manufacturing techniques, but yeah, the price is coming down. So most folks, I think we all kind of recognize that $100 per kilowatt hour for the battery pack is about where you reach price parity with internal combustion engine vehicles. We anticipate in the next year or two that we'll be down to $60 or $62 per kilowatt hour for the battery pack. And so that puts EVs at a price competitive advantage to internal combustion engine vehicles. And if you pair that price advantage with fuel savings, the ability to wake up every day with a full charge and access those publicly accessible chargers throughout the country, it becomes a much friendlier user experience. And so one of the things you did mention, President Biden's executive order, but next Tuesday, we actually anticipate the president will be signing the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and that has $7.5 billion for EV charging in it. We anticipate that being 500 to 1 million EV chargers deployed over the next couple of years. There's also $5 billion in there for transit and buses to really make a difference in our communities. So we think it's achievable. One of the things, if you look at the modeling, already we have about 1/3 of the global EV market that's committed to full electrification. Some of the modeling from the president's Build Back Better plan, plus this bipartisan infrastructure bill, projects that we'll get to 62% of EV sales by 2030. There's obviously a delta there, but I think as the battery packs come down, we have more pickup trucks and SUVs and vehicles on the market that are meeting more, family and community needs. In addition to just, better user experience, fuel savings, we're going to see a real acceleration, and each and every day we're up, advocating for the policies to make that a reality.
Thank you, Joe. Yes, we definitely agree, especially given the all the announcements that were made today at COP. If I may turn to Adriana. Adriana Perez, you're the growth lead at the Wood Group. And the Wood Group may not be the first company that comes to mind when we're talking about electric vehicles and vehicle electrification, but you're doing so much in the US, in the UK, and globally on decarbonizing the transportation sector. Could you share a little bit more about what you're doing to advance EVs, specifically in the UK and the US?
Yes, of course. First of all, thank you for having me. Well, Wood is basically we're a global leader in consulting and engineering, and we are pioneering the energy transition space globally. We are basically working with heavy-duty fleets such as transit, school bus, public works, to understand their operating duty cycle, to create digital twins that we then use for our proprietary tool, which is the zero emission simulation. Our work in the US is focused around transit agencies and helping them answer simple questions of range anxiety and energy demand. One of the things that we launched today at COP at the Wood House in Glasgow is we launched our Accelerating Zero Emission Mobility Viewpoint, where we speak basically about our innovative digital tool, the Zero Emission Simulation. Because this tool uses our transportation expertise and transport data to model simulations and outcomes that help solve the 5 challenges fleet managers have when they're trying to transition to electric vehicles. The challenges are infrastructure, environment, fleet, people, and facility. Because one of the other things that we do is we highlight our experience working with fleet managers, municipalities, utility providers on solutions around EV transition, selecting also the appropriate technology, either if it's a hydrogen or batteries, optimizing the route layout, and implementing charging infrastructure, and pretty much retraining all the operations teams. In addition, we are in constant collaboration with an array of pioneering fleet operations to advance the adoption of the zero-emission vehicles and chart a path forward for the optimal route to net zero. With a host of possibilities for fleet adoption, basically Wood helps paint the full picture for your fleet adoption when converting an entirely new or partial fleets to battery or hydrogen fuel cell power. Basically using the zero emission simulation application and leveraging our transportation specialists, clients gain insight into fleet range, vehicle operating requirements, route scenarios, cost impacts, power demands, and charging or refueling requirements to meet the ambitious net zero goals and transition with confidence.
Adriana, you mentioned working with municipalities and governments on public transit and heavy-duty vehicles. Which of these do you think are most important? Cities, governments, and industry, and where are you seeing the most traction here in the US in your work on electrification of the transport sector?
Well, I think that it's a combination of all, because basically, if you want to build a greener future, all collaborations and partnerships are required. I think that the main, it's just a combination of all. And I think that here in the US, we see a movement that starts from the West Coast and working its way towards the East Coast. We all know that California has made bold commitments and agencies are going from pilot to large scales. However, we're also seeing that agencies are not all working towards one technology solution. Instead, we're bringing like a mixed solution that can provide more resilience in their deployment with hydrogen and incorporated alongside battery electric.
Thank you, Adriana. I think there has been a lot of developments in the sector, and we've seen at COP various announcements that call for governments and industry and others to work together to make this transition more affordable and feasible at a global scale. However, even before these announcements, we've seen last year some disruption in the supply chain that affected car companies' production. Joe, if you can tell us a little bit more about that, given that you represent so many different companies here in the US that may have been affected. What steps can industry and government take to make the EV market more resilient against supply chain shortages and issues like that?
Well, so there may be nothing you can do when the Suez Canal gets blocked, but I think, trying to find workarounds. And I think what we're looking to do in North America, there's probably two primary areas that are worth noting. One is on the chip shortage. So many of our chip manufacturers and even the federal government are partnering to reshore some of that chip manufacturing domestically. The other is on critical materials. And I think, certainly you get some loaded politics when it comes to critical materials. But one of the things that is really clear about the US market is that we've got a lot of natural resources. But what's interesting is no matter where you source those resources, it could be in the US, could be Australia, Africa, Chile, almost all of it goes back through China for its processing and then returns to a market for, the gigafactory to be placed into a battery. And so I think one of the things that we can do, and if you think about resource concerns, shipping all of those critical materials across the globe for processing, is not a very great carbon footprint, but two, we can actually secure the supply chain by building out additional processing. So it's not only about sourcing the materials, but it's also processing and making sure that they're ready for those battery packs. And so those are the two areas that I know that the U.S. is really focused on using policy and driving federal outcomes in partnership with the private industry to short circuit what may be a host of pinch points. Again, it could be literally the shipment of goods and products, or it could be, geopolitical events that we think could destabilize an otherwise resilient market. I think one of the things that's also worth reminding folks is this is not inherent to electric vehicles. One, these critical materials are in our laptops and cell phones and national security architecture. But two, we're also very, very sensitive when it comes to oil and gas for these same sort of disruptions. And so I think it gives us an opportunity to think ahead and to plan and be strategic about how we secure that supply chain and make it a true success story. And again, that's from the North American standpoint, but I think every country is thinking about it in these terms.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is a very good segue to Mike. As a company that manufactures vehicles, to what extent do you think that is global chip shortage is connected to our ability to reach zero emission vehicle targets?
Sorry, I want to say first that we at Arrival are members of Zeta, and so we very much appreciate the work that Joe and his organization do on behalf of zero emission vehicles. The chip shortage and the resource questions that Joe referenced are very important as we think about future supply chains. I would say Arrival's approach to manufacturing, this idea of distributed manufacturing, we see as a more resilient way to manufacture vehicles. You're not manufacturing everything at one location. And it's also a way for us to bring the benefits of local manufacturing jobs to the various communities in which we site these microfactories. As far as the chips, I think that is, at least to the level I understand it right now, it's a supply and demand problem that will work itself out. I think there are much more strategic questions, to Joe's point, around battery components, battery materials, recycling of batteries that we have to work out over time in order to make the electric vehicles and the impact of electric vehicles as small as possible on the carbon footprint of transportation. So a lot of work still to be done there, I believe.
Indeed, and you mentioned just beyond kind of the supply chain shortages, you mentioned battery recycling, and that's an important area for industry, governments, and everybody, and especially also for the Faraday Institution. So, Stephen, you are working on a number of projects related to batteries, including recycling, and as EVs become more popular, of course, the number of EV batteries reaching the end of their life will grow rapidly. And right now, they're very difficult to safely and efficiently recycle. How can regulators promote a responsible, safe battery supply chain while reducing economic barriers to widespread EV adoption?
Yes, it's a very interesting question. Well, I think the first way to think about this question is to think about where we want to end at. And that's with an industry which recycles most, if not all, of its materials, so that the supply chain becomes a different supply chain than the one we have at the moment. So the Faraday Battery Challenge is a target to recycle battery packs from, it's around 10 to 50%. It really depends on what type of battery pack and the material recycling, to about 95% by 2035. And we have a particular project called the ReLib project, which is developing the technological, economic, and legal infrastructure to allow these high percentage of lithium to be recycled. So I think the first thing is to try and move and use research to move towards a recycling. And as well as that is to think about how you can localize the supply chain in particular in the UK, for example, here, or the US, I guess, in your case. And for example, where we've done lots of works and initiatives about doing that. So we've got a potential for lithium mining in Cornwall, for example, Cornish lithium, and we're exploring linking up potential opportunities with Australia, for example, who has a lot of raw materials as well. So I think it's reimagining the supply chain that you have at the moment. As well as that, I think it's important to factor in battery design as well. So in the design of the battery in the first place, to think about how it can be recycled, how it can be reused, and really designed with second life applications in mind, such as grid storage or any other applications as well. And I think the whole kind of regulatory strategy needs to be thinking about waste hierarchy. So thinking about how you internalize social and environmental costs of mineral extraction in the market price, clear regulation and policy of reuse and repurposing. And there's even things you can do with business models around batteries. So at the moment, the battery will rely with the consumer. And so any company wanting to recycle that battery doesn't really get an understanding of the state of charge. If you want to recycle something, it's really around 70 or 80% of the capacity available, when it's good time to recycle and reuse. But they won't know that because consumers. So you could think about new models where the battery isn't owned by the consumer of the EV. But I think, and also there needs to be some physical investments, investments in physical infrastructure as well, battery dismantling facilities, pre-processing facilities, to try and create this recycling. So that's the end state, and that's a rather long conversation about the recycling. But I think in the meantime, over the next 10 years, if we think about recycling industry, it's going to be recycling the batteries that are bought today, because batteries, EVs last, I think, 8 to 10 years. So EVs sold today will be recycled in 2030. So there's some time to develop a recycling industry, but also that time is needed to, develop a social and ethical responsibility supply chain. And I think this is where really, I think it needs multilateral effort, international efforts, to ensure supply chain is responsible, transparent. I think one thing that is important is traceability. At the moment, things like minerals like cobalt is very difficult to trace back through China, which has a lot of the supply chain at the moment, back into countries like Democratic Republic of Congo, to really understand if the supply chain is responsible and legal, etc. So I think there's lots can be done working with civil society to really develop things. And I know that PACT, Mines to Market initiative in the US and globally as well is a good initiative. They've got Responsible Cobalt Initiative, and the Faraday Institution ourselves, we participate in the Global Battery Alliance, which is hosted by the World Economic Forum, which is also trying to develop a sustainable, ethical supply chain. So there's lots of what we need to do over the next 10 years before we can get to an industry which recycles and has a circular economy.
Yes, there's a lot there, and you mentioned the importance of international collaboration on supply chain. Today, the mostly transport ministers from a number of countries met to discuss these specific issues through the UK's Zero Emission Vehicle Transition Council, and there were a number of vehicle manufacturers, OEMs, participating in that discussion because, as you said, Stephen, and many of you, that it's very important to be collaborating, whether it's on research and innovation or with governments on these issues, because they are so complex and span different countries and sectors for sure. Joe, if I could turn to you, because you mentioned previously the Build Back Better agenda. Can you describe a little bit more about how your members are contributing to that?
Well, yeah, so if you think about the U.S. policy, we've kind of got two tracks. There's been a big investment in infrastructure, which, like I said, involves transit, buses, but also charging stations. And the other kind of half is what they'll be working on in Congress for trying to shape federal policy to drive transportation electrification. And so the companies that have gotten together in Zeta, it's I think what's unique is that it's not just a commitment to make progress to deploy vehicles. If they're the utilities partnering with site hosts and charging companies to install the charging infrastructure, but they're also using federal policy to drive the results that we want. And they're using their collective voice to go and, put in front of lawmakers what the right answer is. And so the two most important things that we're hoping to accomplish with the Build Back Better Act, and I think we anticipate seeing progress next week, and then through Thanksgiving and into December, we anticipate hopefully passage. There'll be really strong vehicle incentives for consumers to buy new EVs. There'll be what I think is a real sleeper, which is a used EV tax credit. And again, that's 70% of the market in the US is used vehicles. Most Americans are just not in the market for a new car. And so if we can break down that sense that you need to be able to buy or afford a new car to go electric, that's really powerful. There'll also be commercial heavy duty incentives, a 30% investment tax credit to help companies, whether it's a trucking fleet or a FedEx or a small government fleet, to be able to buy those medium and heavy duty vehicles and get a tax credit to, again, encourage them to go to zero emission. And that's really important because those medium and heavy duty vehicles, while they're only about 10% of the vehicle miles traveled, they're 30% of carbon emissions and over 50% of the pollution and mobile source particulate matter that really impacts public health, especially those frontline communities. And so on the vehicle side, that's what we hope to accomplish. But we also hope to build on those investments from the bipartisan infrastructure bill through the 30C charging tax credit, which will give, whether this is a truck stop, a grocery store, could be a church, tax incentives for them to also go and individually, from a commercial standpoint, invest in charging infrastructure, so that if you're not that family that has a single family home where you're going to wake up every morning with a full charge, that you have ubiquitous and universal access to charging, provide those consumers assurances that as they transition to a more powerful vehicle where they're going to save money on fuel, that they're also being able to adapt that to their lifestyle and be able to charge where it's convenient for them. So those are all the things that we are constantly working on and hope to see movement and progress on in the next 30 days.
Yes, there's a lot happening on the federal government side, and it's a very exciting time indeed. Mike, you definitely work with the federal government, but you also work with lots of cities in the U.S. And as we all know, U.S. states and cities are doing so much and have been for the past, for many years actually, on electrification. Can you give us some background on how you work with local municipalities like Charlotte and Banbury that are trying to decarbonize their fleets?
Sure, I'm happy to. To your point, I think the climate crisis is so important that we need to make progress at all levels of government and policy, whether that's municipal, state, national, or even between nations. To Joe's point, we see the same data. We are convinced that commercial vehicles, medium and heavy duty trucks are a very important lever to bring down emissions as quickly as possible. We also manufacture buses, so we are working very closely with cities on how do we change public transportation to become zero emission and to become a public transportation system that is not only zero emission, but is more equitable as well, as far as the citizens of each community and their access to that zero emission public transportation. And with our microfactory approach to manufacturing, we are dealing with a number of cities. And so, for instance, to your point with Charlotte, we found a city that already has a strategic energy action plan in place, the city government that's very interested in making progress towards zero emission public transportation. And we look forward to working with them in the future on how to accomplish that. With the Arrival buses, not only are they zero emission, but we think they're a considerable change in the experience of the people that are riding on the buses. I think it's broadly recognized that going forward, we need to move more people onto public transportation to address challenges not only around emissions, but around congestion as well as quality of life in these dense urban environments. So we're very excited that our manufacturing approach gives us the opportunity to work with local communities to move the community towards a zero emission public transportation system and to do it in a way that brings local manufacturing jobs to their community as well.
Thank you, Mike. And this is an important agenda in the US and in the UK with our leveling up agenda that the PM had announced last year. I think we can sit here and talk for hours and hours about this, but I know that we have a hard stop at 9:30. And so if I may just ask one last question, Adriana, if I could start with you, what is the one COP26 outcome you're most excited about? And just to say that I'll be asking that same question of everybody. So if you want to have a thought about that.
Well, I think that one of the main things that I'm super excited is basically how our colleagues in Glasgow are bringing all the lessons learned from bus OEMs, charger manufacturers, and utilities working in synchronization to launch the eBus program in there. Because in the end, if we wish to reduce our carbon footprint from transport, we need to collaborate. So I think that that's one of the things that I'm the most excited about.
Thank you, Adriana. Joe.
Well, I think the thing to me that's most exciting is that people aren't talking about electrification as an amorphous or elusive concept that's going to be really challenging. We have the products, we've got the charging infrastructure, we've got the technology. It's just now about deployment. And so you've got states and corporations and municipal and federal leadership all coming together from across the globe to say, how do we do better? How can we take advantage of this new ascendant market and catalyze it so not only does it create jobs and address carbon pollution, but also improves public health in each of our communities. And so it's now the realization that we're not in the R&D stage. This is about deployment. It's possible. And how do we collaborate and work together to make sure that we're doing the best that we can to drive down those emissions and really achieve this new marketplace? And I think there's going to be a big winner. So whoever reaches that clean transportation goal line first, I think will be in the pole position and will be creating tons of jobs and showing global leadership in a way that everybody should be aspiring to.
Thank you, Joe. Stephen.
Yes. So I think I'm most excited about the discussions and initiatives around science and innovation that we had a couple of days ago. I think there's an element of a debate here about some people think we've already know what the technologies are and the inventions are, but I think there's a lot more of research and innovation needed to develop new technologies to help deliver on the COP26 ambition. So the particular example of Mission Innovation, for example, which is a coalition of 23 governments and public investment in clean technologies, and particularly identifying new areas such as clean technologies for cities and for industry. So I think it's important to really really think that we still need to do a lot of research to get the technology, developing further as we move forward.
That is indeed a debate, and maybe it's worth having another panel on that in the future. Mike, over to you.
Well, so directly for Arrival, what we're excited about, we made public our pledge to become a zero carbon business by 2040. We have a company that's focused on sustainability and achieving that and other challenges. I think what most excites me about COP26 is it feels like we're finally reaching critical mass, where this move towards zero emissions is really going to start accelerating, driven by the innovation and research that Stephen talked about, driven by the policy changes that Joe touched on, and certainly driven by companies like Arrival that are dedicated to this challenge and are working solely on zero emission vehicles. It's in our interest to drive this transition and do everything we can to drive it as quickly as we can. And that's what the world needs, obviously, going forward. So I'm excited about what COP26 is accomplishing. I'm more excited about what I think will happen after COP26.
And this is when the UK presidency starts. So we have a year to deliver and help deliver on all these announcements that were made and are still made in those two weeks. And we very much look forward to what this year brings. With that, I would like to conclude our panel discussion and open the floor for the audience to ask any questions. Just looking here in the chat, it seems that there is a discussion on, Roger is saying 2050 is more than a quarter of a century away. It doesn't seem much of a race to me.
Well, I hope that what you'll see happen here, because I think it's a fair comment. 2050 seems a long ways away given the situation we find ourselves in today. And I hope what we see is an accelerating transition, that once this gets started and gets rolling due to further policy moves and increasing competitive and societal pressure, that you'll see it really gather steam and start to move even more quickly in the future.
Yeah, and I would just note that on the EV sales front, we grew 120%, a triple-digit percentage growth from 2019, and so we're seeing rapid acceleration. So I do know that a 2050 pledge or commitment does ring a little hollow to some folks, but that shouldn't negate or I think counterbalance the real material progress that we're making. And I think that's the opportunity that we have before us, certainly in the U.S. with federal policy, is to drive those results and do it in the short term. So we're certainly committed to our 100% EV sales by 2030. We think it's possible, and waiting until 2050. That's the other thing I think. I think he's alluding to this, but every vehicle that comes off the assembly line in 2031 or 2032 is going to be pulling up to a gas station in 2051 or 2052. So that is why it's so important that we move rapidly.
Yes, thank you. Just seeing if we have any other questions in the chat. Just to remind the audience that you can put your questions, type your questions in the comments section, and I can ask them out loud. As we wait for questions to trickle in, maybe we can go back to the kind of the debate around it's time we are ready for deployment versus no, we need more research. So Stephen and Joe, over to you if you want to take that.
Well,
go. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was saying, as this is the UK-US panel, that it is important for us to work together on these things, to put as many of the good brains on these issues as possible. So the Faraday Institution has about 10 research projects over 20 universities and around 450 UK scientists. So we're already working with, as you'd expect, with top UK universities. We're already working with the US, NRAL, Argonne, Berkeley, US universities as well, MIT, Columbia, on sorts of research topics like materials challenges, battery failure and safety, sustainable battery management that I talked about earlier, battery modeling and machine learning. And in particular, just as an example, the RELIB project that I talked about earlier was we're working with the equivalent program in Argonne, which is the ReSAR Centre. So there's lots going on, but I think, as always with these things, that we can do more. I mean, in the political context, in June of this year, I think the US President and UK Prime Minister revised the Atlantic Charter, commissioned a joint statement committed to strengthen science and technology collaboration, and that included batteries as well. And the Faraday Institution ourselves were thinking about what to do in 2022 around this. So we have a planned visit to the US. Some of our researchers want to explore the national labs in more detail and link up now that travel is much easier. Well, not much easier, but slightly easier. And we're working with as many partners as possible to really develop the research going forward.
Yeah, and Stephen, I think the way that I would frame it is there's going to be, I think, an enormous interest and I think wave of research and development. But I think one of the things that's interesting, and I wouldn't want to leave consumers with the wrong impression. We have really great vehicles on the market today. Dozens and dozens of new vehicles are going to be coming on the market in the next year or two. But I think it's worth distinguishing that, these are not a, 60, 70 mile range, 2009 Nissan Leaf. We've got cars that are coming off the line that, have 300, 400. I know the Lucid vehicle was just rated at 500 plus miles of range. So I'm really excited about the fact that this is no longer elusive. We've got the vehicles that can meet consumers' needs, can meet fleet users' needs. And so I think in the short term, it's about deployment. And certainly we need to move those vehicles today so that there's those used vehicles down the road that can reach folks that are lower down the income scale. So there is going to be huge developments in both charging times and solid state batteries, and we need to be going in full force. And actually, Secretary Granholm at the Department of Energy here in the U.S. every week has been announcing new grants for companies and those doing research in this space. So it's very, very important. But I wouldn't want to leave consumers with the impression that there's inferior products. You have more performance, more torque, just as much range, and you can save 80% of your refueling costs by going electric. And so I think it's a huge opportunity, and it's now a critical challenge of actually putting the policies in place to move the vehicles and actually make the transition. We can decarbonize in the short term. We don't need to wait for a breakthrough. Obviously, those are going to come. There's going to be cost reductions and improvements, but we can make decarbonization and emissions reduction gains today.
Thank you, Joe. You touched on the culture of EVs and owning an EV. Maybe we can come back to this after this question that we have from the in-person audience in Atlanta. The question is, what are your views on the utility sector implications in terms of generation capacity? Anybody want? Mike?
Yeah, I'm certainly not an expert in this area, and I think the answer differs by region and by country. I think that, this is something that, at least based on my conversations with various electric utilities, the utility industry sees it coming. It's not like it's a surprise. And so when you look back historically at the rate at which the utility companies have been able to add generating capacity over time, the forecasts for electric vehicles are well within what the utility industry can handle, at the same time moving towards more renewable energy. Joe, I have to assume you've looked into this question as well.
I have, and one of the things that, I think at a simple level, people think more kilowatts used means more generation required. But actually in the short term, and I think this is, we've got several years of runway, you can more efficiently use the grid, and electric vehicles actually provide you the opportunity to do that. And that's with managed charging, with demand response programs. So basically you're shaving the peaks in the valley. So you're encouraging consumers to charge while you've got excess solar, and maybe to curtail charging in use cases where you're at peak power. So it's an opportunity with the current generation capacity to actually, and this is actually really valuable for utilities. So the same level of generation with more kilowatts being sold. And so for PG&E, out of California, investor-owned utility, they went and provided $350 million back to consumers because of EVs allowing them to more efficiently manage their grid. And the other thing that I'd note about the grid, which is I think really exciting, is that once a internal combustion engine vehicle rolls off the line, its carbon footprint is set for the rest of its life. But with EVs, as the grid gets cleaner, the carbon footprint of the cars also continue to get cleaner. And so as we look about deploying more renewable energy, that's going to make the carbon footprint of EVs less and less. And actually, the Union of Concerned Scientists has a great map, talks about per region what your carbon intensity equivalency is. And in many parts of the country, you're at 200 or 300 miles per gallon as part of carbon equivalency for electric vehicles because of how clean their grid is. So there's a ton of potential here, and I think working with utilities not only as a partner for generation and producing the kilowatts, but also deploying infrastructure and working with site hosts to ensure that we've got universal access to charging. There's just a ton of opportunity.
And just building on that, in terms of opportunity, we talk a lot about vehicle grid integration and the opportunity to consumer. Some of your companies and members, perhaps, Joe, that are working on that vehicle to grid technology. I'm really keen to hear from the panel on kind of where you think this potential is. Are we past the R&D, the innovation stage? Is the opportunity for consumers right here or in the next few years? And it gets even more interesting when we talk about heavy duty vehicles because of their large battery capacity. So maybe Arrival, are you guys thinking about that? Adriana, keen to get views from the panel.
Yes. Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was listening. My the link was kind of like on and off. Well, one of the things that I also realize now, talking when we're gonna come about utilities, is there are so many projects that are statewide. For example, in New York, there is we're working and partnering with a utility company called CONET on figuring out how to pretty much provide solutions to the grid, because it doesn't matter. One of the things that Joe mentioned is when you have like a charge management plan, you can pretty much figure out how to electrify your grid without having any type of power outages or issues with the overall grid. I think that in the end, the key item here is always to work in collaboration and in partnerships and understand that this race for fleet decarbonization is for everybody. Everybody needs to be, because basically what is leading the fleet decarbonization? If we have policy fundings and commitments, we have social demands, technology, innovation, and economics. And I think that by everybody working together, we can reach out and help with the net zero race.
Thank you, Adriana.
I would add, Reem, and yes, vehicle to grid is something that Arrival is working on. I think to your point, it's especially interesting with commercial vehicles because you tend to talk about a fairly large number of vehicles that work on a set schedule or a known schedule. So it's easier then for the utilities to plan around the availability of that battery capacity. You've seen a couple of projects in the US already announced around school buses, which obviously are large electric vehicle fleets that operate on a very set schedule. So I think there is a lot of opportunity here working between the electric vehicle industry and the electric utilities going forward on how to optimize the grid.
Thank you, Mike.
And I might just jump in to say, I think one of the, bidirectional charging is one of the bigger, I think, technological advancements where we need to come down the cost curve on level 2 chargers for bidirectional charging. But what that allows you to do, it allows aggregators to come in And because what you don't want to do is have a cycling problem, right? If Mike's delivering a vehicle, you don't want to have degradation of the battery because every hour you're going back and forth to the grid. But what you can do is, depending on the region, figure out what are the 3, 4, maybe 5 times a year where you have a confluence of events that really puts peak power demand and really escalates, kind of those demand charges and that pricing. That's when those batteries can have as a huge resource and can actually create almost a virtual power plant. If you're talking about demand response, or providing direct power, a positive load to the grid. And so for Mike's vehicles or others that are doing fleet, certainly school buses that may be sitting for the vast majority of those summer months, there's just enormous potential. And that actually, it's not just about a service for the grid, it actually can provide a revenue stream to make it cheaper for utilities or fleet managers actually to afford the vehicles if there's still a higher upfront cost. But it makes the economics work out and makes our grid more efficient.
I mean, that's a good point there about the degradation of the battery. It's an important thing that is often overlooked, that if you're continually charging and recharging a vehicle to grid, there'll be degradation of the battery. We have a project looking at degradation run by the University of Cambridge, but I think many people don't factor that into the business model, and so that's very important. And on just another point, coming back to the grid, where the focus of attention at the UK at the moment is reinforcing the grid where it's needed in terms of strategic hubs, motorway service stations, so that's what we're working on at the moment. So, rather than concerned about needing extra generation capacity for all these millions of EVs, which is not so much of an issue, I think, because they'll be charged overnight when much less energy is used.
Thank you all. This is very exciting. Definitely a great opportunity for consumers and utilities and everybody. I think there's so many opportunities with just electrification and the transition to a cleaner transportation system. But I am afraid we have to close this discussion right now. And if I may hand over to Andrew Staunton, who is the British Consul General to Atlanta, for closing remarks. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Reem.
Hi, thank you very much, Reem. I think this has been a fascinating panel. Some of you might realise that I'm actually from Glasgow. Glasgow is my home city. I was there only 2 weeks ago. And there's a very famous song in Scotland, I belong to Glasgow and Glasgow belongs to me. So I'm very hopeful that when we look back in 2050, that the people of Glasgow are proud with what the COP26 delivered, and that the people of the world regard that summit in Glasgow as the fundamental time when we really started to make this transformation. I'd like to thank Reem for her wonderful moderation. I'd like to thank the panelists. We're here in the southeast of the United States. I'm coming from Atlanta. We're having an in-person event at this moment. We've got colleagues who are actively interested in that transition. And I know that this morning's session has stimulated people to start thinking about how we can work together. Yes, transatlantically, yes, regionally. One thing I've been very struck by as I travel around the southeast of the United States is that economic development opportunity. Some of the panelists have talked about this. If you look at what the manufacturing sector is in the southeast, you have become the FDI automotive sector of the United States. So there's a great opportunity through that economic development lens to build on that, to ensure that the batteries, the cars, the trucks are all based here and being made here. That's an economic development opportunity, but I think there's also a responsibility for the governments of the Southeast to really lean into the target agenda at the federal, state and city level. So thank you very much for that, and I'll now pass you back to Reem in San Francisco.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to our panelists again, and to the the Consul General in San Francisco, Joe White. And thank you so much to the audience for being with us in person in Atlanta and also online. With that, we wish you all a good evening or a good afternoon, depending on where you are.